Gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I know I've been digging a little deep into the AEI bench of late, but then again, I think AEI is the best think tank in the universe, so why wouldn't I do that? You know, if you worked in a great Cuban cigar shop, you might actually smoke some of your own Cuban cigars. Today we have a first-timer by popular request, both in terms of the person, but also a lot of the subject matter, because I'm often accused of ignoring things like climate change on here, even though I've made my own views fairly well known. And part of the reason why I've waited to find a good climate change guest is they're hard to find. The field is so politicized, and frankly, as my guest will probably attest, full of nerds. So, the honest nerds are hard to talk to because it's all about weird numbers and Greek witchcraft, or they're part of a big groupthink hive collective kind of thing, in my opinion. And so what we were looking for was an honest broker. And what it turned out is there's this guy who writes this Substack thing called Honest Broker. I follow him on Twitter. It's a great Substack. He's also now a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute. It's Roger Pielke Jr., not a climate scientist. He's a political scientist who studies these things very closely and a bunch of other things, which we'll get to. And again, his Substack is called The Honest Broker. Roger, welcome to the Remnant.
Jonah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I one of the things I just want to do is sort of a primer. I'm sure that in your life you do not live in Washington D.C. You run into what we in Washington D.C. call normal people, and they will often ask you things like, "How worried should I be about climate change?" Or "Is it a hoax?" Or "Is it exaggerated?" What do you tell a normal, sane, educated person who just is trying to figure out how to think about it? Like, how concerned should they be? Who should they trust? How skeptical should they be of politicians? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I do run into a lot of normal people, and it turns out normal people on climate change, they don't really think about climate change all that much. They care about taking the kids to soccer or how much groceries cost and things like that. To the extent that they do think about climate change, it's, I encounter people that are, very polarized. It's all fake. It's a hoax. It doesn't mean anything. On the other hand, some people say, yeah, it was, 92 in Boulder yesterday. There's climate change. And so, what I tell people is, yeah, climate change is real. It's serious. It poses risks for the future. It is not, at least according to the current science, an existential threat. You can't see it out your window. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where the scientific community does wonderful, great work. There's also a lot of dreck out there. And normal people have a really difficult time telling the difference. And the media doesn't help. So in the universe of politicized science issues, climate change gets the gold medal. Mm-hmm. It's up there. It's super politicized. And it's really hard to separate the wheat from the chaff.
On the Boulder is 92 degrees thing, my wife's from Fairbanks, Alaska. Like, it's funny. You'll now get people, there's a subtle distinction, which you'll get, which is that they'll say they buy some global warming, but not necessarily climate change, in the sense that it's undeniable it's gotten warmer up there than, particularly in the summer, than in the past. But they also, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in all this. So one of the things, and I used to traffic in a lot of this, and I still think there's some truth to it, right? That the part of the appeal of the climate change argument, other than the sort of man's natural tendency to catastrophize and emphasize, have a negativity bias, is that it allows a lot of ideological people to do things they want to do otherwise. It's the whole sort of, the green agenda is also vaguely anti-capitalist, and sometimes exceedingly anti-capitalist. I always point out that the anti-oil movement started when people were still worried about global cooling and a new ice age, after, the Santa Barbara oil spill. In the world of actual climate science, how much of that do you think is there? Because there are a lot of people in sort of conservative circles who project that they're all fake, and that's not my experience. I think there are a lot of very sincere people who take this stuff really seriously, even if there is some motivated reasoning involved.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people with enormous goodwill who love doing science, who are in atmospheric sciences broadly, including climate sciences, who just want to better understand the Earth. At the same time, I have noticed in my career, now spanning 30 years, that there has been an attraction of the community to people who have more of an advocacy bent. There's a paper that was published earlier this year that surveyed climate experts, and not just physical sciences, but climate experts, on their views on what's called degrowth, shrinking the size of the global economy. And it turns out there's an enormous overrepresentation of degrowthers in the climate sciences. So this is a challenge for any area of science where you want to, survey what science says or put together assessments that if, the people involved are all of a particular ideological persuasion, you're going to get warped results. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which, if it didn't exist, we'd have to invent it, is an assessment body. Their Working Group 1 on physical sciences has, for the most part, played things pretty straight. Working Group 2, which is on impacts and adaptation, is deeply, deeply politicized. And so this is a challenge, an institutional challenge, is how do we have strong science institutions in the face of a community that, is not at all representative of, in a lot of ways, the people around the world that it's talking to.
Yeah, I want to get to the IPCC in a little bit. So, back to what you tell normal people. If you had to tell them, okay, here are the 3 things you actually should be legitimately worried about, what would they be?
So we're altering the energy balance of the Earth system, and in a lot of ways, but primarily through the emission of carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels, and that creates uncertainties in the future climate. It doesn't guarantee, catastrophe or the apocalypse. But all else equal, we probably shouldn't be doing that. At the same time, the world gets enormous benefits from the consumption of fossil fuels and the amount of energy that we consume. All of our lifestyles in the rich world are made possible by fossil fuels. Everything that I'm wearing and all of the goods I encounter in any day that make my life more convenient come from fossil fuels. So, the second thing is, given that there's risks, if we can decarbonize the global economy, we should. And the second thing most people don't know is that in terms of carbon dioxide emissions per dollar of GDP, the world has been decarbonizing for a century because we like efficiency. It makes us richer. And even without climate change, we like cleaner burning fuels. So when we talk about climate policy as, getting off of fossil fuels, we're talking about accelerating a process that's already in place. And we're good at that. And that's a technological challenge. And the last thing I would say is that, your decisions, my decisions, eat a hamburger at lunch, drive an EV, whatever, those are in the noise. Those don't really matter. What matters is how we produce, the large scale of energy around the world. So coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, solar, that's where decisions are made that will affect the future trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I mean, it's also worth pointing out, we're also dematerializing. Right. I mean, it's not just that we're decarbonizing, we're using physically less physical things increasingly, which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, that's an important factor also. I mean, a great example is agriculture, where the amount of land used for agriculture has peaked, and yet we continue to produce more food for people around the world. Another big factor that people, are only now starting to become aware of is that the expectations for global population have really come down in recent decades. And, pretty soon we'll be talking about an underpopulation problem, not an overpopulation problem. So in many respects, this whole dynamic is going to shift in the coming decades, I think, as people get a sense of what a rich world looks like compared to this kind of rich and poor world we have right now.
Yeah, I just off the top of my head, I want to get back to that. But, one of these things that people love to point out is carbon intensity, like how much per capita of carbon people use. If population numbers start to shrink dramatically, will that mean that carbon intensity goes up just because, even though
Yeah, there's the numerator and denominator there, and it really depends. The biggest lever that's out there for decarbonizing is the carbon intensity of energy, not the carbon intensity of population. And so there will be choices made around the world about, do we retire coal power plants? That's the biggest tool in the toolbox for reducing carbon intensity. And nuclear, do we expand nuclear around the world? So the decisions are the efforts to control population kind of came and went. And so, where we have control is over our energy supply. And, obviously energy policy is important for a lot of reasons, but those choices will dictate the future of carbon emissions.
Yeah. So on the crowd that's on the disproportionate support for degrowth that you mentioned among climate scientists, right? I mean, that sort of points to one of my biggest peeves. When I spent 20 years at National Review, I've been, was Fox News guy. I've been surrounded all my life by people who just say it's all a hoax. It's all a myth. I don't think it's a hoax. I don't think it's a myth. But nor do I believe that just because the climate scientists are directionally right, that means they're the people I would go to fix what is now an economic problem, right? I mean, like, there's a difference between the ability to diagnose something and the ability to deal with it. And I would much rather economists or engineers, whoever deal with it, but like the idea that comes out of the climate universe is this degrowth thing. Is that let's just throw a wet blanket on the problem rather than work the problem, like fix the problem. I in my heart, really like the idea of geoengineering stuff. And I'm just sort of wondering, like, if you don't think it's this existential threat, maybe that's also a way that decreases the case for geoengineering, right? Because like the geoengineering is kind of a last ditch. We have to do anything we can. Geoengineering makes a lot of sense if you think it's an existential crisis. Maybe it doesn't if it's not an existential crisis. How do you sort of adjudicate that?
Yeah, there's a few things. So 30 years ago when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, at that time it was humanly possible to listen to or read every congressional hearing ever held on climate. And I did that. And there was a dynamic I noticed at the time is that you have these climate modelers who come before Congress and they say, technical this, technical that, technical that. And the first question invariably from members of Congress would be, okay, what do we do about it? And they were asking the wrong people. They're wonderful people at modeling climate systems, but they're not economists, they're not political scientists, they're not policy people. And, given that the climate models have some pretty, simple knobs in there, one of them is carbon dioxide emissions emitted by humans in a global economy. If you turn down the global economy, you get less emissions. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very seductive and easy to fall into the trap that we're not solving a real world problem, we're solving a modeling problem. And to do that, we just turn a dial. Another element of it is a lot of it's probably our parents' generation, but a lot of the concern over global population and resource extraction and consumption came out of the 1960s and 70s, Paul Ehrlich, and the idea that there's just too many people and we're consuming too much stuff. And a lot of that sentiment and also individuals moved into the climate space. And so there has been this very natural tendency among some, not everybody, but among some in the climate space to favor strategies of austerity and degrowth and abandon capitalism, which, hasn't been particularly helpful. My view is, good luck. Poor people want to be rich people want to stay rich. And so, degrowth is a non-starter. I tend not to talk to it. Geoengineering is interesting because to support geoengineering, you need to have a faith in the precision of scientific modeling to a degree that it's not warranted. If we're unintentionally altering the energy balance of the Earth system, that's pretty bad. If we intentionally try to do that, who knows what results will happen? We have a lot of experience in the atmospheric sciences with weather modification. So in the 1950s and 60s, there was efforts to try to alter the behavior of hurricanes, dropping silver iodide in the clouds and such. It so happened that a particular hurricane took an unusual turn, went into Central America. And then there was talk, we're going to have lawsuits because you caused this disaster that we have. I think it's much better to reduce the human influence on the climate system than to accentuate it. So I'm actually a signatory to a non-use geoengineering letter that was put together because I think it's just it's like introducing cane toads into Australia. You be careful what you unleash because it might not be what you expect.
I mean, I'm with you. I mean, that's in the so far as if you don't think it's an existential crisis, then by all means, don't treat it like it is and do some sort of, Snowpiercer kind of solution kind of thing. At the same time, you can make a case that it's sort of like, the money the United States government would save if we cured Alzheimer's and related diseases is staggering. It's hundreds of billions of dollars a year, right? It's sort of like with Ronald Reagan in the Cold War. How about we win it, right? Like if you actually, rather than contain the problem or maintain the problem, solve the problem. And I could make an argument that as a cost-benefit analysis, it would be smarter. I mean, I'm for getting rid of coal over time for reasons that don't have to do with necessarily climate change, but like you can do a lot of that mitigation stuff for other reasons. But at the same time, if you thought there was a good faith, good chance that 30 years of R&D into this would pay off with, in effect, penicillin for the planet to cure its fever, that would make, and just get as rich as hell for the next 30 years to get to that point. That would make a lot more sense than even quasi degrowth stuff that you get from a lot of people, a lot of broken window fallacy stuff about alternative energy sources and all the rest. And I'm not saying do it tomorrow. I'm not saying rush, but I would rather be in a position to solve the problem in 30 years than to say we slowed the rate of warmth by 0.2% according to the Kyoto Protocol kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a few things there. I mean, the penicillin example is a good one, I think, because in the real world, we have drug trials, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. With geoengineering and planet Earth, we get one trial. So, if it's a drug that kills the patient, well, bummer. That's too bad. So, I mean,
that's why pencils have erasers.
Right. Then we're heading with Elon Musk to Mars. So it's not really the same. And I do not believe we will ever have the sort of understanding of the global Earth system that we have of the effect of drugs on the human body through drug trials. So that's one big part of it. The other is that the solutions that we need to decarbonize, they're not all in place yet, but we have a lot of technologies that we could use to move in the direction of accelerating decarbonization. One of them, nuclear power. I'm a big fan of nuclear power. I often say that if nuclear power was invented in 2024, everyone would be hailing it as a miracle solution to the climate problem. It has a lot of history and a lot of baggage. But for example, in the United States, we have a lot of coal plants that have been shuttered. More will be shuttered. They're already connected to the grid. If we were to build nuclear power plants on those sites and put juice into the wires, we'd go a long way to decarbonizing the U.S. economy. There are countries like China and India that are continuing to build out and rely on coal. It has nothing to do with environment or climate. It has to do with economic growth and mainly energy security. Coal is fantastic for energy security because you can pile it up, you can see it, and you can have some guaranteed security of supply over time. So eliminating coal is eminently doable, technologically possible. And if you're, I often say, if you're afraid of climate change, that's fine. If you're afraid of nuclear power, that's fine too. If you're afraid of both, you probably have a math problem because you're not gonna make a big dent in decarbonization without it.
All right, so makes me sad that you're so adamant about geoengineering, but it's not a bad argument. What about just in terms of things like our mutual friend Ron Bailey was the first guy who told me about this years ago. It's like 35 years ago, and I've been fascinated with it ever since. Not so much geoengineering in terms of the penicillin model, but things like artificial reefs, right? Things like, we now know that oil rigs actually generate a vast amount more biomass, when they knock them over in the Gulf of Mexico or whatever, because it just turns out that like a lot of sea life is looking for good habitat. And if you make it, they don't care that it's prefab or brutalist architecture. They like it for the habitat. There are lots of things that along that model. If I didn't suspect that so much of the planted tree carbon offset stuff was a grifter fake thing, I would be much more enthusiastic about it. I like the idea in principle, and I think that's probably why it makes so much money. I just don't believe that a lot of it is honest. But what about things like there was that experiment a few years ago, or I guess it was about 15 years ago now, where you'll correct me on the right term, but I think it was like iron sulfide, iron oxide, where they poured it into the ocean in a controlled, this is a testable thing, generate this big boom in plankton, which then had all these knock-on effects while it also drew the carbon, it helped mitigate ocean acidification, which is one of the problems with climate change. Like there are problems that come from climate change that I want to deal with. Why not put down tarp or something on top of Kilimanjaro to get the snow back, right? I mean, there are those kinds of things that don't have to do with fundamentally altering the climate energy system, the planetary energy system, but they still mitigate a lot of the things that bother people about climate change.
Yeah. So, I will put an asterisk on geoengineering, and there is one form of modification of the climate system that I do think makes sense, and it's called direct air capture. So that's building machines that suck carbon dioxide out of the air.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, it can be used to make cement. You can sequester it in geological formations or deep in the ocean. That is just a cost benefit issue. It's very expensive. It makes our energy more expensive. Maybe you can turn it into liquid fuels. Maybe you can turn it into cement, but it adds a cost that you wouldn't otherwise have to pay. That makes sense. That's it. And the direct air capture gets a lot of opposition because it's a technical fix. You don't have to change your behavior. You don't have to change the economy. And so, one of the challenges for climate is that some people see it as a vehicle to, let's change everything. And it turns out normal people don't want to change everything, and they kind of like their lives. So, if there was a technology that, we would invest in, and 30 years from now, it's at a low enough cost that we may decide to deploy it, that would be direct air capture. If you're putting tarps down on Kilimanjaro or putting, iron fillings into the ocean, you're still messing with an Earth system that we don't fully understand. And it is the cane toad example in Australia that there will be enormous unintended consequences, unforeseen results, inevitably when we start messing with the Earth system.
But I hear you, but we're already messing with it, right? I mean, we have tumbleweeds in America. We got, mongoose in Hawaii. We got zebra mussels, which are making the water cleaner in the Great Lakes. I mean, this is going on. And I'm not for doing it unadvisedly or hurriedly or any of that kind of stuff, but we are stewards of the earth. There are places where we can make improvements. We just have to be careful about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you see whenever there's a hurricane or tornado nowadays, you'll get people in the media in particular, but some scientists going out, well, this event was caused by climate change, or it wasn't caused by climate change. Imagine if we start tinkering with the earth system. And lawyers would love it because the latest hurricane or tornado, people would say, well, that was because you put that tarp down over a mountain, or you put iron fillings in the ocean, or whatever. And it would just be the same sort of scientific food fight that we have now, plus the possibility of some really nasty outcomes. So my view very much is if there are easier, more deployable, cheaper paths to take, particularly if they make sense for other reasons, why don't we exhaust that pool of options first before we go to the things that we don't really have to deploy?
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why I would just love to have cold fusion is I would love to get rid of all of the hydroelectric dams in the the Pacific Northwest. Because I'm a big charismatic megafauna fan.
Right.
I want to just restore environment and those kinds of things are blights. Although the Hoover Dam is kind of cool. All right, so I want to move to the hurricane stuff. And just for level setting, I'm getting the vibe from you that you do not think we should nuke hurricanes. Is that correct?
A well-placed nuclear bomb now and again, No,
I always, because it happens every summer. Some idiot puts it on Twitter or something, and people start talking about how we can. And I think Trump was flirting with nuking the hurricane.
Right.
And also, every single time, the one place I'll always agree with climate scientists is problem with nuclear hurricanes is all you do is then have a radioactive hurricane, which is worse
than
a normal one. But more seriously, you've written a bunch about this of late. It's been an increasing pattern for the last 10 years to say that the proof of climate change causes hurricanes and that climate change is becoming much more expensive is using data, real or alleged, that show that insurance payouts are getting more expensive because of hurricanes. Can you walk us through all of that?
Yeah. I mean, if there is they're literally the poster child for climate change has become hurricanes, at least in the United States. And it goes back to 2006 when Al Gore had his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, had a Hurricane Katrina coming out of a smokestack. The hurricane was spinning the wrong way, but, details. It's interesting because hurricanes, let's just focus on Atlantic hurricanes, and we could talk about, the globe, because the Atlantic's only about 15% of all tropical cyclones worldwide. But if you go back to when records are reliable, which is about 1900, the scientific community, this is not me saying it, this is a scientific community, IPCC has concluded that we cannot detect changes overall beyond natural variability in the behavior of hurricanes. And yet every hurricane that occurs, every hurricane now, it was worse, stronger, more intense, more north, faster, slower because of climate change, whatever the hurricane happened to do. Hurricanes are interesting because there's not a lot of them. The U.S. has been hit by about 200, a little bit more than that over the last century. And so we can count them. They're really big. They don't go unnoticed. And so we have good data on hurricanes. And it is absolutely true that the costs, the damage associated with hurricanes has skyrocketed over decades. And I've done with my colleagues a lot of research on this, that the increase in damage can be 100% explained by more people, more property, more wealth in harm's way. It's not rocket science. It's fairly obvious. When I give talks, I show a picture of Miami Beach, 1926, and a picture of Miami Beach today. And you don't need any math to see that it's changed a lot. And so if you want to look for signals, evidence of climate change, the worst place you can look is trends in economic damage associated with extreme events. It's an easy story to tell, and it gets, policymakers and people who make decisions about land use and building in dangerous places, gets them all off the hook. If you just say, it was climate change that did it, it wasn't our dumb decisions. So hurricanes are a bottomless well of misinformation and symbolism for the climate debate that, for people who make real decisions in the real world, like in reinsurance and risk management, they understand pretty well what the data says. They just don't go out in public and say it. Last year, the Financial Times reported on a closed door meeting at Lloyd's of London, where a Lloyd's executive said, we haven't seen a signal of climate change, and that was like big news in the Financial Times. But in places where risk matters, people understand the data. Everywhere else, it's kind of a mess.
All right. So since you raised the point about how when that Lloyd's of London thing leaked, it became a huge news. I mean, this is one of the things you cover in Honest Broker, is the degree to which self-censorship, or sometimes not self-censorship, but imposed censorship, skews the debate, right? It's like it's funny. You two of the things that you write about, they're not the only things you write about, but two of the things you write about, transgender stuff and climate change stuff, are two of the areas that seem most prone to this sort of thing right now. You're just you're not supposed to say this kind of stuff. How much of a problem is it? How debilitating is it to the scientific enterprise? And would you advise someone if they wanted to go into climate science, and to one extent or another, would you tell them to do it, even though that if they were going to break with the conventional wisdom, would you still tell them it's a career worth pursuing? Yeah,
it's a great question. I would tell people that if you're going into a particular area, let's for research, for science, and you want to change the world, you better think really carefully, because science needs good scientists who do good research. Science is not the best lever for changing the world. Maybe if you cure cancer or something like that, it is. So I would say, understand the difference between being an activist or, a policy analyst, or, someone who's involved with politics and doing research, because you can do both, but they're not always so compatible. There is, I tell my students when they, my grad students, when they would say, all right, here's what I want to do my dissertation on. If you're focused on the topic everyone's talking about right now, you're probably going to be behind the curve when you finish up in 5 years, or, you're doing research in 10 years. So focus on what you really care about. And maybe the world will catch up to that, or maybe not. But if you care about it, you probably don't care. It is difficult to be in climate science. I mean, I'm lucky. I've been around for a long time, and I've survived various events and occurrences. So I feel pretty secure. I think that for a younger researcher just going into the field, there are enormous career pressures not to be asking difficult questions or challenging narratives, which is what we do in research. That's the whole point of what we do. So I do think there's a lot of caution there. That said, people have to follow, where they're interested, and I'm a big fan of being aware of the route ahead, and let people make their decisions with their eyes open.
So it's funny talking about where the next big fashionable thing to study is. One of them right now is AI. Has AI impacted climate? I mean, AI, I think, is a little overhyped, to be honest. I'm not saying it's not going to do impressive and wonderful things, but I think we're in a little bit of a bubble on the hysteria for AI. That said, one of the things AI is like really friggin' good at is pattern recognition. Are you seeing it change the modeling for the better?
AI is really interesting because it's right now you can see a lot of negative effects it's had on science and academia. The number of papers that are written via AI, is steadily increasing, and there's ways that people study that and detect it. Teaching in universities is difficult because students turn in AI assignments and they're graded by AI graders, and there's no reality in the middle there. On the positive side, AI is a tool, and it has hallucinations and doesn't always get its math correct. But I've used it in a few analyses, particularly for complicated statistics and probability, and it works really well. So AI is a tool like any other tool, and we can use it well and we can use it poorly. I have not seen evidence that AI can be used to advance scientific thinking or research faster than human beings can at this point. Maybe we get to that point. It definitely has significant applications, as you say, in pattern recognition and things like medical sciences and so on. So I think, I do think there's a bit of a bubble and it's overhyped. And, if we look at it on the positive side, it should make us professors be better at our jobs. We have to design teaching and assignments for students so that they can't be just simply AI exercises. But that requires a lot of work on our part. Critical thinking is never going to go out of fashion. And so if it forces us professors to focus more on teaching students how to think, not how to turn in assignments, then so much the better. But there are, risks that it makes everybody lazy and they don't learn anything in the process.
Yeah, it's funny. I have some very successful friends in world of finance and Wall Street and all that kind of thing. And I always ask them about AI, and they say it's interesting and they look at it and they're playing around with it. But at the end of the day, all it is just another form of algorithm. And they've been dealing with, particularly the quant types. Their incentives were already aligned to find the best way to find patterns in markets. And AI is not a quantum leap forward in the ability to do any of that stuff. It's a tool at the margins. It's interesting. The place where it's having the biggest impact, or at least getting the most attention, I shouldn't say the biggest impact, but the most attention, is people who work with words, right? And because basically it's like a plagiarism machine. And it would be a much bigger sign of its transformative effect if all of a sudden everyone was talking about not getting rid of lawyers and journalists, but of financial, wizards and quant people, because that would show that it's actually better at humans at the math. And it doesn't seem to be yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where there's the larger risk. I mean, I built a little bot based on my Substack, The Honest Broker, that's trained on, whatever the millions of words I've written. I haven't put it out there yet, but you can engage with it, and it sounds like me, and it takes all the words I've had in the past and puts them together in a way that sounds like me. But there's no originality there. There's nothing new. There's no current events. So, I do think that AI will, and this is the history of technology, it will continue the process of automating jobs, work that is lower on the intelligence scale. That just happens to be moving up.
Right.
So it is going to cause churn in some industries, and historically, when we got rid of bank tellers and had ATMs and so on, that's been a good thing for the economy. It's something we need to anticipate and deal with, though, because it will disrupt industries and people.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely tell a young person, if they didn't want to go to college, do not aim to be a paralegal, aim to be a plumber. Right.
Right. Exactly.
People are always going to need plumbers. And let's turn for a second. This will help me steer towards the Olympics, but on the international side of these things, right? So you've written a lot about the IPCC. How much of this? Well, let me back up. Let me do it this way, because you mentioned Al Gore before and Inconvenient Truth. What has held up from that movie, legitimately prescient about what the world would look like, by now? I just saw Bjorn Lomborg had the thing about the polar bears, and they're doing fine. Where have been the doom? Where's the sky is falling stuff been accurate or partially accurate, and where has it just missed the mark?
Yeah, I'm flippantly, I'm tempted to say nothing has held up. The world hasn't ended. Carbon dioxide emissions have slowed down, and they're close to plateauing. The world envisioned 2 decades ago is not nearly, the apocalypse or heading towards the apocalypse in any way, shape, or form. That said, climate change, it remains real. It causes risks. We affect the climate system. Ted Nordhaus at the Breakthrough Institute did a nice job saying, it's more like diabetes than cancer. It's something that we have to manage, and it's not going to end us. And we've lived through this before, at least people of a certain age, with the population crisis of the 1970s, with the idea that, there's going to be mass famines, there's going to be people overrunning the planet. There's a lot of racism and a lot more in those stories, but, the world hasn't gone in that direction. And some of the more extreme doomerism of the climate movement is along those same lines. And so I try to avoid this. It's easy to get sucked into pushing back against degrowthers and doomists, but the reality is they get a lot of airtime. The media seems to love them, but they have very little impact on policy or politics in most places, because you can't. There's not a whole lot of people who are going to go live in Idaho and under the ground, maybe a few. But if you really believe that stuff, that's the sort of action that you would take. And by people's actions, most people don't buy that stuff.
Yeah, I think the degrowth thing is very similar to the defund the police thing. It's the kind of thing that sounds really cutting edge and transgressive and smart and utopian to a very tiny number of people and who have outside influence. But then you go talk to normal voters and you say, what we're going to do? We're going to pull all the police from your community. They're going to be like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And similarly, like, what we're going to do? We are going to make you poorer to fix the climate. And they're like, are you freaking kidding me? It's like, there's no political constituency outside of the sort of the rent-seeking community, which is maybe that's the segue to the international community. Because what I was thinking of is like one of the other things that Bjorn was talking about was all those islands that were supposedly sinking. Turns out they have more landmass now, but in a sort of James Burnham kind of argument, there's a playing on white Western guilt about colonization and all these sorts of things. is a great rhetorical mechanism for wealth transfers. And how much of that sort of agenda drives a lot of the international community stuff on climate change? Is that this is the argument that works on the guilty white rich West, on weird people, the acronym, right? Not the JD Vance talking point. And how much of it is like legitimate? Because I think the developing countries have a good argument that if we're going to force on them essentially non-growth, if not degrowth policies, and not let them do industrialization the way we did, if we're going to impose that on them, then there should be compensation for it. But I also don't think we should be imposing a lot of that stuff on them.
Yeah, it's super easy to get really cynical on this stuff. There was a great paper put out by a group of Indian scholars last year, Kanekar and others, that looked at the scenarios that are used by the IPCC to project the future. And in all of the scenarios, the rich world gets richer, the world decarbonizes. The poor countries get richer also, but at a lower and slower rate than the rich countries. Right. And it's very hard to justify things like opposing fossil fuel use in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, when my refrigerator uses more energy than a family of 4 does in a year in many of these countries. So the international dimension of climate change is really interesting, because if we took seriously poverty, a lack of energy access, and climate change at the same time, the policy agendas would look very different than if all we did was focus on carbon dioxide emissions. There are a few places that are reducing emissions pretty rapidly, Europe and North America among them. But we're already rich. And I think it's really easy for my students and some of my colleagues to think, well, a decarbonized world is just the world I have right now, just less carbon. And I have all the access to electricity and energy that I would ever need. It looks very different if you're in Southeast Asia or a country in Africa where most people don't have that access. So the international dimension, I think, one of the things we are going to see over the coming decade is going to be the rise of India and China in particular, eventually Africa, as power centers in discussions of energy and climate. And the dominance, and it's both a dominance of representation, but also a dominance in scientific research of the West, is not going to last. And policy is going to look a lot different when that happens. And I think it's inevitable.
So one of the things you often hear from conservatives in particular who are, it's a Donald Trump argument, which I don't despise. He says, look, I want clean water. I want clean air. I want, a healthy environment. And it's his way of sort of signaling that he's for conservation and environmentalism without necessarily buying into the climate change stuff. I'm directionally sympathetic to some of those arguments. Like I worry greatly about like the decline of elephant populations and the Amazon rainforest and these kinds of things. And one of my great frustrations is that journalistically, basically everything has to be a climate change story. At least going back to the Rio, conference, there were two things that came out of that. One was climate change. The other one was biodiversity. Biodiversity is now basically a subset for mainstream media of climate change. And you can't have coverage of almost any environmental story where there isn't a to be sure paragraph about how this is all made worse by climate change. Some things are not made worse by climate change. Some things are made better by climate change. And some things just don't have anything to do with climate change. They have to do with poachers or deforestation or that kind of thing. Is there a realm of conservation or of environmentalism that really concerns you, that you think is getting short shrift because of the sort of maniacal obsession with climate change stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, all of them. Climate change has, one of my colleagues, I think it was Mike Hume at Cambridge, has called, climate change a Christmas tree, that people can come and hang their ornament on it. If you had to design an issue that had symbolic power, but was very impotent in the real world, it would be climate change. The reality is you and I really can't detect climate change. Climate change, by definition, is a change in the statistics of climate over many, many decades. The World Meteorological Organization uses 30 years, but others use longer time periods. If we were to turn off the spigot of carbon dioxide emissions today, we wouldn't be able to see the effects on the global climate for many, many decades. So it's not like, okay, we can stop a war in the Middle East by climate change, or we can save elephants via climate change. And so there are a lot of issues. One really important issue is air pollution. Anyone who's been in Southeast Asia in the spring, knows that the burning of land for agricultural purposes and, dirty coal and so on leads to some really bad air. That kills people. That's really, really bad. And yet, a lot of times the discussion is about the carbon dioxide emissions associated with emissions and not the particulate. So there are a lot of issues that have been subsumed to climate change, and I think it has done a disservice to the discussion. And even beyond just climate change, the idea that a global temperature target, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, is the best indicator of the state of the planet or humanity has really done a disservice to a lot of the analysis we might do in the environmental space.
Just on that for 2 seconds, one of the things I find kind of fascinating every time I go down a rabbit hole on it is on the economics and political economy of fresh water. It's funny. Every now and then I'll listen to some NPR, Diane Rehm style conversation. I know she's retired, but like some sort of NPR conversation about the water crisis. And for some reason, water experts seem to be somewhat immune to it's like they haven't gotten the full memo about making everything about climate change. And they'll say, no, it's more to do with distribution and infrastructure and these kinds of things than it has to do with climate change. I mean, there are droughts and we can talk about that, but like, it's just really hard to get fresh water from point A to point B if there's no fresh water closer. And at the same time, you do hear a lot about climate change stuff. Remember Mad Max was basically about oil and water wars, right? And that was a lot of the Paul Ehrlich stuff too. It's like oil and water wars. Where are we on fresh water? Is there a freshwater crisis in the world, or how much of the drought stuff should we think about in terms of climate change, or is it really sort of like most famine is man-made because of wars and politics, not the lack of abundance of food? Is it the same thing with water?
Yeah, water is managed by us. And, a lot of the water use, consumptive water use, particularly in the United States, is for agriculture. And here in Colorado, there's, as people like to move to Colorado, there's a transfer from agricultural uses to urban uses. There are many places around the world where fresh water is a challenge. It is a problem. One thing that's expected as climate changes in the future is an intensification of the hydrological cycle. So that means, on average, probably more rain in more places. But and this gets to what you talked about before. The best way to have water security is to build dams. Right. And dams can be used for hydropower and so on. They change local environments. And so the water challenge is very much like the food challenge. It's about policy and decisions that we make and technologies. And, it's not surprising that there's plans for big dams in Africa. China built its Three Gorges Dam. Having water security is part of a big modern economy. And so not everyone has that. But in the United States, in particular, I think we're in pretty good shape water-wise. All
right. I don't want to keep you overly long, but climate change is maybe the inapt phrase, but it's an evergreen topic. There is something closer to in the news at the moment, which is this, which you wrote about on your Substack earlier, I guess last week, about this controversy at the Olympics about whether or not the Algerian boxer, right? And I don't want to put my thumb on any scales beyond just sort of referencing to it. What's your take on the whole thing and on this issue more broadly?
Yeah, so this is an issue. Gender categorization in elite sport at the Olympics has been an issue for many, many decades. But just to boil it down, there's really there's a fork in the road, and people choose to go down one of two paths. One path is to decide who is a man and who is a woman, and to categorize based on some some objective determination of who gets into be in each category. Another path that we could go down is to say, well, society, people are born, they're identified as male or female, they're raised as boys or girls. Society makes those hard decisions. And I'm not, in this instance, I'm not talking about trans athletes. I'm talking about people with continuity since birth. And then they show up in elite sport. So in that case, it is perfectly acceptable for someone to say, you know what? People with these characteristics are just too good. She might be a woman, but because of her unique biology, she's just too good to compete with other women. It's not safe, whatever. That's great because then we can use science and evidence. So if you think somebody's too fast or too strong or too big, then quantify it. Tell me, what are the characteristics of an individual who is unsafe to have with others? And then you can apply those. Then you don't have to judge that someone's really a man or really a woman.
Sort of like weight classes in boxing, right? You wouldn't have the top, the heavyweight fighting, the featherweight.
Yeah, we do that. And, when I was in junior high school, we had the lightweight football team and the heavyweight football team. We got 6 foot and under basketball. We do this all the time.
I'm in the heavyweight podcasters league, but that's a different topic.
It's super difficult, I think, for sports organizations to try to enter a space where they are trying to redefine somebody's identity. I know it gets caught up in today's politics, and particularly in the UK, for some reason, people love that debate. But if the issue is unfairness or safety, then this is something that science and evidence can apply. In Australia, Australian rugby does this well with trans athletes. They evaluate athletes on a case-by-case basis. Some are allowed to participate and some aren't. And it's not about redefining or letting a sports organization say who's who. The most disturbing thing about the Algerian boxer situation was that, everybody online is talking about her biology, how she looks, and so on. And, I don't want my medical information out on the internet. You don't want yours. And anyone who's doing that is crossing over into some bad ethical territory. So my view very much is, can we set up processes that are respectful of human dignity, human rights, but also ensure fairness in sport. And once you boil it down to the evidence and science, it becomes a lot more straightforward. That doesn't address people's desire to police how people look or, who's really a man, who's really a woman. But it does offer a pragmatic, practical way to deal with this. After all, sports are an invention. We make up the rules. They can be whatever we want them to be. So why don't we just make the rules such that we're decent people, is my view, and leave the culture wars to others.
Yeah, no, I on the boxer herself, I'm with you. It's like the number of people who wanted to say that she was trans when there was no evidence that she's trans.
Right.
She was raised a girl all her life, and it's murky about the hormonal stuff and all of that kind of thing. But like the people who are just saying, "Oh, she's a man," I mean, I hope that woman is not reading her Twitter feed.
Right.
Because it's freaking cruel. Even if it does kind of feel like there should be a stand. I like your point about just it's not even necessarily science driven so much as just sort of objective, fair rules, and then apply them, universally, and which is a principle that you don't have to invoke science to agree with. I mean, science is going to inform maybe what those standards are, but that's how we do chess, right?
Right.
We do lots of things,
Yeah, well, and chess also has adopted rules trying to police who's a man and who's a woman. I mean, if
have
people
they really?
Yeah, they have. They say
I haven't followed that.
Yeah, they say trans women have an unfair advantage over other women, which is interesting. If people wanted to, and this is how I, my test of seriousness on this topic, they could advocate for chromosome games. All right, XX here, XY over there, and don't even use the words man or woman, and that would achieve what a lot of the gender advocates want. A lot of this is people using sport, because people care about sport, to advance this broader social agenda surrounding gender. Just to put the scale of things, in the Olympics, the best estimates are somewhere between 10 and 50% of athletes are doping. So they're cheating. So that's something like 1,000 to 5,000 of the athletes. There were 2 boxers everybody was talking about. If you really care about fairness in sports, my view is, why don't you go to where we have the biggest fairness issues, and not, it's gender is important, it matters, but it's always going to be a marginal issue because there's just not that many people that fit into the categories that people, want to police. On the other hand, cheating in sport is endemic and rampant, as we saw, for example, with Chinese swimmers and so on in the Olympics.
And we should tell people, just so people know, you've been writing about sports stuff. That's sort of one of your specialties for going way back, right?
Yeah, I've been doing sports stuff for almost 20 years. It's when I was teaching my grad students stuff, I found, they were jaded and they knew everything, or they thought, on environmental issues and conventional science policy issues. So I looked for a topic where science matters, but people haven't really thought about it a lot. And, running on cheetah blades, doping, gender controversies in sport, not only are they just super fascinating and interesting, but for my students, it really opened their eyes to being able to see science in politics in a way that they couldn't on issues that they were just, surrounded by every day.
Before we close out, what is another area of politics where you think the science is more involved than we think, but it's also more distorted than we think, where this sort of corruption, maybe not the best word for it, but this sort of misapplication or Hayekian scientism, is at play?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so, in science policy, generally, things work really well across the board. You and I will go to our supermarket and you'll buy an over-the-counter drug and you'll put it into your body without a second thought, because we trust the processes, whether we know it or not, that lead to that. There are a very few issues that become super politicized, where conventional scientific norms break down. Climate change is near the top of the list. Another is COVID. Remarkably, and this is a failure of Trump and of Biden, the United States does not have a high-level pandemic advisory committee. I led a study, a comparative study. It was about a dozen countries around the world, looking at how they organized their experts to inform decision-making in the pandemic. No one got it exactly right, but there was no place other than the United States that we found that didn't have some mechanism for putting experts together. The coronavirus task force of the Trump administration was political appointees. And so if you want to know how not to put together an advisory body, that was probably it. The Biden administration does not have a high-level pandemic advisory committee. So when questions come up like, do you wear a mask, or what's the guidance on closing schools and so on, you got 50 states that may or may not have their own advisors going in different directions, and it's super easy to cherry pick. And this has not been corrected. And the most obvious and visible example is the COVID origins debate, where if it was an airplane crash instead of a pandemic, we'd have the NTSB out there investigating and find out, look at the black boxes and let's find out why it happened so it doesn't happen again. It's one of the biggest failures of science policy, probably in my lifetime, is that we don't know, and that whether it was out of a lab or not, this is something that we should know, because researchers are saying, hey, let's do the same sort of research, but more of it that some think was the origins of the pandemic. So, there are these very high salient, significant issues where science does break down. And I'm a big fan of institutions, and we need strong institutions for, governing that interface of science and politics. And sometimes they break down. Like when I started my career, this was an esoteric, weird, strange area of public policy research, science policy. And today it's become something that's, a lot more significant and important.
I mean, I know I got to let you go, but I'm just curious about this, because I generally agree with you, and Matt Ridley's been on here a few times and he's a friend, but how much of the blame for not knowing do you put on our own scientific and sort of political policymaking community, and how much of it is just actually a really thorny geopolitical problem with China, where they just don't want to admit that regardless of of its origin, they probably are the ones who caused it?
Yeah, I mean, it's the answer is yes. And if as alleged that U.S. funded research conducted with little or no oversight in China, then yes, the U.S. government is also complicit in the possibility of a lab leak. Nobody wants that to occur. Put the overlay on it of the vitriolic politics of 2020, and when Donald Trump said he thinks it came from a lab, that pretty much set off. The Democrats weren't going to have any of it, and I give a lot of credit to the Republicans in Congress, Brad Winstrup, for doing the investigation. Not only has that uncovered new information, but if you take a close look at those hearings, the Democrats and Republicans started out super antagonistic and polarized. They're much closer together now on, there's no certainty, but they're much closer together on the range of possible options. It will take leadership. Who knows what happens in the next Congress if the next president says, hey, we're going to do a 9/11 style investigation of this. There's a lot of information that could be obtained out there, for example, in the research journals and reviews and correspondence that is not out there. There are people that have been called before Congress that could be investigated criminally and maybe encouraged to open up about some things. So I don't think it's the end of the story by far, but there's a lot of blame to go around. And however the pandemic started, U.S. policymakers have not completely, but largely failed to do their oversight job. And this is Congress. Again, the House Oversight Committee has done a very nice job, but they've only scratched the surface.
Fair enough. And there's a lot of places we can go with that, but I agree with that almost entirely. So Roger Pielke, sorry. It's a name I've read because of you and your dad for so many years, but it's one of those names you pronounce inside your head differently than the way you're supposed to. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So Roger Pielke has left the studio. He has a bit of a Tyler Cowen problem, which is what we use internally. It's my phrase. Ramesh Ponnuru has a Tyler Cowen problem too. And when I say that, it's really my problem, but they're the ones who illuminate it, which is that people who give short, pithy, extremely responsive and constrained answers to questions leave me in a lurch about how to ask the next question. Because usually I listen to the thinker think out loud and I try to pick up on where they're going or all that kind of stuff. But Roger has this, it's a positive thing, this ability to answer very directly, succinctly, and fulsomely in a way that I'm like, crap, where do I go with this? So if I seemed a little off the game, that's sort of why. It's also why I front load sometimes my position into the question because, well, it's my podcast. Lots of other things I would like to talk to him about. I'm going to have to noodle more and read up more on his, alas, reasonable and superficially, at the very least, persuasive argument against the geoengineering stuff. I have not abandoned that position. I've never been let's just plunge right in and try to just give some mad scientist $100 billion and do whatever he wants kind of thing. I don't want, crazy, if we get it wrong, we destroy the planet kind of things. But I'm a little skeptical that there can't be trials and controlled experiments that could get us further than he's just, but he also knows these things much better than I do. So I'm going to have to look into it more. Other than that, we're going to do more episodes like this of sort of, eat your spinach, back to basics, get up to speed on things that you feel like you need to get up to speed on episodes. So if you have topics that you think we should cover in the near future or in the medium future, for whatever reason, I don't know why you wouldn't want to do it in the near future, let me know. And that's all I got. So I'll see you next time.
Jonah, no, you won't. This is a podcast.